something, which was a rip-off of the bulletin pages in Marvel Comics, where they would talk about all of their staff and employees using the alliteration that Stan Lee, you know, Smiling Stan, Jolly Jack, Sturdy Steve, all of this. Actually, when you actually enter the comics industry, you find that Jack wasn't always jolly, and Steve was sometimes far from sturdy, but that Stan was always smiling. But in this lame English knockoff of the Marvel style, they talked about all their staffers as well, and they talked about their youngest sub-editor, Sonny Steve Moore. And I mean, I've known the guy now for 40 years. He's not sunny. He can be a bit miserable sometimes, you know. But they announced that their employee, Sonny Steve Moore, was going to actually be doing the first British comic convention. This was like 1968. And I couldn't attend that because, like, my parents wouldn't let me. It was really unfair. But I was down as a supporting member, and because in one of the fanzines that they sent with your membership pack, if you like, Steve Moore had been unfortunate enough to actually put his address in there. So I started stalking him. We became friends, and I went along to the second British Comic Convention, which was at the Waverley Hotel in London in 1969. And it was fantastic. If you'll just permit me a moment of dewy-eyed nostalgia. There were about 50 people there, and that was everybody in the country who liked comics. Everybody. There were a couple of comic dealers, but there weren't really any comic dealers back then. The only one was the immortal Derek Bram Stokes, who ran a hippie comic shop. I think it was the first comic shop and possibly the first science fiction and fantasy shop in the world. It was called Dark They Were and Golden Eyed. Yeah, alright, it was the 60s. Yeah. Taken from a Ray Bradbury story. But yeah, Bram would be there with these fantastic, the latest paperbacks, which had got like Frank Frazetta covers and, you know, covers by people like Graham Morrow and Roy Krenkel. These names mean nothing to you, do they? It's sort of, they were great. It was things that we hadn't seen before. American paperbacks, the latest American comics, and some old comics. Unbelievably, he'd have copies of like the Vault of Horror from the 1950s, but they'd cost something like £2.50, and you could get a mortgage for £2.50 back in the 60s and still have change. But, so you've got these 50 people wandering around. Most of them were under the age of 20. There were a couple of, I mean, nobody anywhere near as old as I am, but there were a couple of adults there, I suppose just for supervision, really. But everybody was there because of their enthusiasm for the comics medium. And none of the publishers bothered sending anybody because there were only 50 people there. What's the point? It's not like the huge conventions today, and I'm not talking about this one. This is, I think, a different kind of animal to the last conventions that I attended and the ones that I've heard about since. The conventions today seem to be largely incredible trade fairs that have very little to do with comics, largely to do with, I don't know, action figures, movies, new television series. And it's kind of extraordinary that these people, they must be, I don't know, rubbing their hands in glee and disbelief that they can get thousands of people to come along and pay to be advertised to. You know. Anyway, this was very different back in the day. There was, like I say, nobody from any of the publishers, and there was nobody like me there. There were no comic creators with vastly inflated egos who sort of came along thinking that they were all that when they weren't. Instead, we've got Frank Bellamy. Now, Frank Bellamy, a Kettering boy. He was a local man, and he took over Dan Dare from Frank Hampson after Frank Hampson had found out that he didn't actually own Dan Dare, which he created, and had a bit of a breakdown, apparently. But anyway, Frank Bellamy took over. He was probably one of the most accomplished artists that this country has ever seen in terms of comic art. He was incredible. And he was there with a couple of other people, and they were all astonished that anybody had ever heard of them. You know, like I say, a far cry from, you know, people in comics today, and I'm including myself, we're little pop stars, aren't we? You know. These people were professionals of the first water. They were really touched and amazed that anybody liked their work. I remember Frank Bellamy saying, "Oh, no, this is marvellous. I really didn't realise that so many young people, I'm 50, so many young people liked my work. I brought some along, and I can pass it around if you'd like to look at it." And so we were sitting there, sort of just staring at these pages of Garth and Thunderbirds, just sort of awestruck and passing them on. He was a lovely man. And everybody at that convention, well, I'm not saying everybody, but all the people that I was talking to, most of them went on to have a career in comics. That was where I met Steve Moore, met Jim Bakey, who was already a published comic artist, met Steve Parkhouse, who I'd like to go on to work with. Kevin O'Neill was actually at the convention, but I missed him. Didn't get to meet him back then. I even met Barry Smith before he changed his name to Barry Windsor Smith in order to convince Americans that he was part of the royal family. Actually, Barry was a pop star even back then. He'd got, I think, mirror shades indoors and a kind of fur coat. I was really, really impressed, you know. But the consensus amongst the people back there, it was progressive. We were starting to see, you see, in America, when comic fandom started in America, it first started in the late 50s with Appreciation magazines, some very good ones, based upon the N.I.C.E comics that had just been trampled out of existence by the Comics Code. That was, hang on, I've just lost my thread. What was I talking about just before that?
American
fandom, right, thank you. It's my age. With American fandom, when it started out in the early 60s, the first superhero fanzines, which were things like Roy Thomas and Jerry Bale's Alter Ego, they were largely talking about the heroes of the 1940s, which was when Jerry Bales and Roy Thomas had been children. That was the heroes that they'd first connected with. So what I'm saying is that when American fandom started, it was already nostalgic. It was based around nostalgia for vanished comic book heroes, and they would have campaigns to, I don't know, bring back the Atom or things like that, to reinstate their favourite 1940s heroes. In English comics, we didn't really get started until 1967. And 1967 was a funny year. It was where the the hippie explosion, the psychedelic movement, the summer of love. It was when all of that happened, and most of the hippies always seemed to be very fond of comics. I know that Bram Stoker's shop out they were in Golden Eye, the IT, International Times offices, were right next door. And they'd always pop in the lunch hour to get their copies of Doctor Strange or The Silver Surfer or whatever they were reading. So it got both ways. There was a lot of influence on the underground from comics, and there was certainly a lot of influence on comics from the underground. Everyone had got a progressive agenda. We wanted to do comics that took the medium further, that did things that were starting where people like Eisner and Kurtzman had left off. Things that were taking in all of the new developments that were happening at the time. The psychedelic art, the influence of the underground artists, all of this stuff. And yeah, we had very high hopes. And like I say, around that point, I was more or less finished with reading comics. I was only reading the occasional title that I'd still got an interest in. Most of the original creators that I'd loved had been alienated from the industry by that time. And they'd been replaced by people who frankly weren't as good. I mean, the creators like Gardner Fox and John Broome that I was talking about, these had invented most of the DC characters. Around the mid-60s, they suddenly noticed that they were writing all the books, that they'd invented all the characters, the Flash, Hawkman, all of those. And yet they didn't have any pension scheme. They didn't have any medical insurance, which is an important thing in America. Increasingly so over here as well, but back then it was an important thing in America. So these civilised professional men and grown-ups, they went in to talk to the heads of DC, and they said, look, we've been thinking about this. We haven't got any medical insurance, we haven't got sort of any pensions. Why don't we kind of form a group to negotiate in everybody's best interests? Negotiate with the company so that we can have these things and we can carry on happily working for you, and I suppose you'd call it a union, something like that. And the people at DC said, well, that's really fascinating. You're all fired. And they just fired all of them because the comic fan thing was just kind of getting off the ground around then. And they'd suddenly got all these young men, school leaders, who were obsessive comic fans and who would pay to write Green Lantern, who would pay to write the Justice League, and who would certainly never threaten their position by mentioning things like unions or stuff like that, or wanting to be treated fairly. And I suppose the reasoning of the people in the comics industry at that time was, well, we don't need these guys anymore, these old guys. I mean, they've created all the characters for us. We own the characters. We'll get these enthusiastic comic fans to actually write these strips for us. And what they seem to have overlooked is the fact that these are comic fans, and that's not meant as a slur to people who are fans of comics. But it's pointing out that if you're a fan of something, you're probably not the best person to be writing it. It kind of leads to a process where it's very marked in television and in movies and in comics and in all sorts of areas today, where people who were fans of a certain show or a certain book have ended up writing it. And what they want to do is to recreate the magic that that book had for them when they were at the age when they were most influenced by it. So it'll end up being a kind of an incestuous process. They are trying to reproduce the things of yesteryear, So they're referring to stories that possibly happened before most of their current readership was born. And then you get another generation who are fans of them. And it was slowly, it's like inbreeding, it was slowly, at the end of it, after a couple of generations of that, you're going to have some pretty funny looking kids. You know, like with one big cyclops eye all squashed up round the side of their head or something. You know, it's not healthy. You need to have ideas and influences coming in from a wider world. You can't get insular about it. This was what I was noticing with the comic strips of the 1970s. Luckily, I had got other things to be doing in the 1970s. There was great music around. There was a social life. You know, like it was, and I was having to earn a living. And in the later 70s, I was married. I'd got a child on the way. That was the point. I was working for a subcontractor's gas board, and I just thought, now I'm 25, I don't want to be filling out invoices for a gas board subcontractor when I'm 50. If I'm ever going to do what I said I was going to do what I told myself I was going to do, which is somehow support myself, or either writing or drawing, or I had a brief period where I thought I may be able to be a rock star or something like that, but no, that was a quickly shattered illusion, you know. But I thought, okay, yeah, I'm just going to leave work. I'm going to throw myself on the mercy of the social security system, such as it is, and really make a go at drawing or writing and supporting myself. So I handed in my notice. Then I got a phone call from my then wife saying that she was pregnant, which put me in an unusual situation, because I thought, well, it would be mad to give up a dull but dependable job with a baby on the way. On the other hand, if I leave it till after the baby's born and I've got those two big hungry eyes looking up at me disappointedly, no, I'm never going to have the guts to make a move like that. So I decided to take the suicidal option, and I went ahead with quitting work, and yeah, we were living up there on a sink estate. The baby was born. It probably wasn't until, for a couple of months, I really didn't do anything. Or rather I did, but I did impractical stuff. I decided, I'd seen the excellent early issues of 2000 AD, and I thought, oh, this is fantastic. This is, and you know, it had got scripts by John Wagner, Pat Mills, who are both very, very funny people, who had been driven a bit mad by having to work on girls' comics for about a decade. I know that towards the end, John Wagner, who's a very good writer and a very mordant individual, he was writing a strip about the blind ballerina, and he was just getting really nasty towards the end. He had the blind ballerina's wicked uncle leading her into the fast lane of the M1, telling her that she was being taken out on stage to perform at the Albert Hall or something like that. Right, but he had started, him and Pat Mills, Kevin O'Neill, and all of that early crowd were turning out the kind of comics that they would want to read. And it was brilliant. They were comics that worked upon a couple of levels. You could read Judge Dredd, I suppose, and think, yes, he's a really good action hero. But John Wagner's script was just screaming, he's a fascist. You know, in every couple of panels. It was talking about law and order taken to a ridiculous extreme. It was a satire. And I thought, yeah, maybe I could actually do something that I'd enjoy for these people. So, after quitting work, I thought, yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw and write and letter a huge space opera that will be like an epic. I've already got the first 300 pages in my head. Now I'll sit down and I'll draw them. Anyway, about 4 or 5 months later, I realised that I'd got 1 page inked, but not lettered, another page half inked, and a page of not very good pencils. And I thought, this is not going to work, is it? It's like, yes, I can sort of draw, but only if I get a long time to do it. These people who were working in the industry, people like Brian Bowen, people like that, they were capable of much more beautiful work than I was ever going to be capable of, and they could do it a lot quicker than I could. Although perhaps in Brian Bowen's case, not that much quicker. But he was very painstaking. But so I thought, right, this is not going to work. And I realised, I thought, why am I doing this? And I thought, I'm doing it because it isn't going to work. I'm doing this impossibly long science fiction script, which part of me knows I'm never going to finish. Because then, I will always have the fond memory, when I've gone back to work at the gas board subcontractors, I'll be able to think, when I'm approaching retirement in my 60s, I'll be able to think, well, I could have been like a great writer or a great artist, but I just didn't bother with that, but I could have been. I would still have had the dream, you know? Whereas, if I sent something in, if I finished something and sent it in, what if it got rejected? I'd be crushed. I wouldn't even have the dream anymore. What if they said, no, you're nowhere near as good as you think you are? And I didn't think I was very good. So that would have been crushing. And I thought, yeah, that's it. I'm frightened of actually putting myself to the test. And I thought, well, obviously, this is all down to me. There's nobody going to help me, and there's nobody trying to hinder me. So it's absolutely down to me. If I want to do this, I have to take responsibility for it and just do it. So I went out, I bought a couple of copies of the music papers. I noticed that Sounds, which was a music tabloid back in the day, that had got a couple of, that usually ran a couple of half-page strips, and it was currently running just one. And so I thought, oh well, maybe there's a vacancy there. So I did 2 half-page strips, writing, drawing and lettering. Not very well with any of those things, but I did at least have the sense to cover it in lots of tiny stippling, which if you can't draw, I would advise, yeah, do a lot of stippling instead, because it really impresses people and it's easy, and if you've got a sympathetic editor, they might think, he's going to be blind in a couple of years, we better give him the work while he's still sort of capable of reading the checks and sort of things like that. So, yeah, so I did 2 sample episodes of a strip about an alcoholic, deluded person who believes himself to be a film noir private eye. I sent them in, and we got a telegram back, because we didn't have a phone in those days, a telegram back that was saying, like the strips, stop, when can you start, stop, as telegrams used to say. You know, it'll be email these days, wouldn't it? But, yeah, I phoned them up, they said, yeah, the second one, there's some problems with it, but if you can redo that, then you've got a weekly script. And this was fantastic. Eventually I realised that I only had delusions of adequacy as an artist. I still couldn't draw well enough or fast enough, but for a couple of years I was doing that strip in sound. That taught me an awful lot about meeting deadlines and also about telling a story. That even if it's every week, you're going to have a beginning, a middle and an ending, a sort of a punchline to finish the script with. I was also doing a 5-panel gag strip in the local paper called Maxwell the Magic Cat, which taught me the same thing. It was only 5 panels. But every week you've got to introduce the script to the reader, set up your situation and get to some sort of punchline or conclusion by the end of that limited space. So after a couple of years of this, I realised that I actually couldn't draw, or couldn't draw fast enough to ever make a living out of this. But I was still friends with Steve Moore, and he was still making a good living, or at least a decent living, out of writing the comics. So I asked him if maybe he'd have a look and give me some hints, tell me how you actually went about writing a comic strip, you know. And he explained it was fairly easy. You know, you put your panel description there, then you put the dialogue underneath that, then you move on to the next panel, you describe your panel, you put your dialogue under that, and so on. He read my first efforts at a script, which I think was a Judge Dredd script, and he tore it to pieces, very instructively. He said, look, you've got far too many words in this panel. This panel is unnecessary, it doesn't tell the reader anything. You've got too many panels on a page here. And this was all great stuff. It was stuff that I needed to know. And eventually I managed to get some stories accepted by 2000 AD, Doctor Who Monthly. These were little backup scripts, tiny short stories. But they were invaluable. If anybody here does seriously want to be a writer, I'd say start out with a short form, because it's not like a 300-page science fiction epic. Yeah, everybody's got one of them in their head, I'm sure, you know. But you're never going to do it. You're never going to do it. It's too big. You've got no idea what writing 300 pages of anything is like. Start out with something short. Start out with little short twist-ending future shocks or something like that, where you create the entire world, you set up your situation, you introduce all the characters, you bring it to a conclusion in 4 or 5 pages. Now, if you've been doing 5-panel strips, then to have 2 or 3 pages seems almost agoraphobic in the amount of room that you've suddenly got. But you just scale up your thinking. So I was doing the best I could with those future shocks. I thought, well, if I've got this opportunity, I ought to use these stories to say something. Yeah, all right, sometimes they were just a dopey joke or just an imaginative little bit of entertainment. But sometimes I'd be actually trying clumsily to say something. I remember there was a story called Grawps Bearing Gifts, which was basically about a load of really vulgar, unpleasant aliens who arrive on Earth. They're all like wearing Bermuda shorts and like really tacky shirts and things like that, and they're loaded with money, and they go around buying up national monuments for these their currency, which is huge gold bars. And at the end of the story, they've given so much gold to Earth that gold is now worthless. All of Earth's economies have collapsed. These aliens, the Grawps, have taken over, and it says that, oh yeah, and they've like redesigned Earth masterpieces like the Mona Lisa so that it fits in more with their tastes. And it says, yes, but as for the Earth people, some of them still had reservations. In fact, they had plenty of reservations. And you've just got, I think, Margaret Thatcher and a couple of others. You might remember Margaret Thatcher. She was the Prime Minister back in the day. But you've got them sitting around in what is obviously like the human equivalent of, it's like